In December of 1835, New York City was the largest city in North America. 270,000 people lived south of 14th Street, packed onto a 3-square-mile grid at the bottom of Manhattan Island. The banks were there, the shipping houses and the counting rooms, and the dry goods, merchants, and the tanneries, and the slaughterhouses were all there, pressed together on streets barely wide enough for 2 wagons abreast. On the night of December 16th, a fire started in a dry goods warehouse on Merchant Street. It started from a burst gas pipe. Within an hour, it had spread to the buildings on either side. By midnight, it had jumped Pearl Street. By morning, it was moving toward the waterfront. It burned for 2 days. When it stopped, 674 buildings across 52 acres of Lower Manhattan were ash and rubble. The property loss was $20 million. In today's dollars, roughly $700 million. Gone in 48 hours. The fire companies of New York arrived within minutes. They had their equipment. They had experienced men. What they did not have was water. The wells were frozen solid. The cisterns were empty. The East River was 50 feet below the wharf level at low tide. Firemen formed bucket chains to the Hudson River, half a mile away in December cold, and the buckets were not enough. They had no pressure. They had no supply. They had no system. A city of 250,000 people had no mechanism to move water in sufficient quantity to fight a serious fire. And so they watched 52 acres burn because a city of 270,000 people was drawing its water from 14,000 private wells sunk into the same ground that held the privies and the boneyards and the tanneries and the rot of a colonial town that had never solved its own water supply. That fire settled the argument. Men had been talking about piped water in New York since Alexander Hamilton proposed it in 1799. There had been surveys. There had been plans. There had been a private company, the Manhattan Company, chartered in 1799 under a bill pushed through the legislature by Aaron Burr, specifically to bring water to the city. The Manhattan Company looked at the cost of actually building a water system, decided it was too expensive, and turned itself into a bank instead. That bank, over 150 years of mergers and acquisitions, eventually became J.P. Morgan Chase. The city got water carts and a pump on Chatham Street they called the Tea Water Pump. Water sold at 3 cents a barrel to the people who could afford it. Cholera had come in the summer of 1832 and killed 3,515 people in 4 months. The physicians who understood cholera, and there were few who fully did because the germ theory of disease was still 30 years away, had been warning for years that the wells were the problem. Every one of those 14,000 wells was sunk into the same aquifer that received the drainage from the privies and the slaughterhouses, operating within a block of nearly every street in Lower Manhattan. The water smelled like what it was. You could taste the city in it. People who could afford to bought from the tea water carts. People who could not afford to drank what came out of the well and tried not to think about it. Cholera killed 3,515 people, and the city still did not build the aqueduct. The fire moved the money. In June of 1836, 6 months after 52 acres of Lower Manhattan burned to the foundation stones, the city held a referendum. Should New York borrow $5 million and bring water from the Croton River in Westchester County, 41 miles to the north? The measure passed, just barely. The men who voted against it said the project was a fantasy. You could not carry a river 41 miles by gravity alone, over ridges and through valleys and under hills and across the Harlem River and into Lower Manhattan without pumps, without the kind of technology that did not yet exist in America. It would bankrupt the city if you tried, and it would fail even if you did not go bankrupt first. The engineer who said it could work was 42 years old, and he had started his career as an axeman clearing brush for the Erie Canal survey. I have been going through the Jervis papers at the New York Historical Society for the past several months. They are held in flat archival boxes, pencil-written notebooks with brown leather covers, survey books, and calculation books, and letter books. The accumulated working record of a man who spent his entire career building things in the American outdoors. The writing is neat and tight and precise, the way a man writes when he knows that the record he is making is the only one there will be. I keep coming back to one particular notebook from the fall of 1836, the early survey notebooks for the Croton project, because of what it shows about how the job was approached, not with confidence, with systematic caution. The notes read like a man cataloguing everything he does not yet know, so he can fix it before it matters. That man was John B. Jervis. Jervis was born in 1795 in Rome, New York, the son of a farmer who had cleared a homestead in the Mohawk Valley when Rome was still a cluster of cabins at a crossroads. He had a common school education and nothing more. In 1817, when he was 22 years old and the Erie Canal was just getting underway, he walked to the survey headquarters at Rome and asked for a job. He was hired as an axeman, clearing brush for the survey line at 75 cents a day. That was the same summer DeWitt Clinton drove the ceremonial shovel into the dirt at the canal's starting point, on ground a 10-minute walk from the Jervis family farm. Jervis could not read a surveying instrument when he showed up. He was shown how by the man above him, and he practiced in his spare time, and within a year he was a chainman helping with the actual measurements. Within 3 years, he was a section superintendent. He taught himself trigonometry from English textbooks by lamplight, sitting at a plank desk in a construction camp bunkhouse at night. He had no textbooks written in America because there was almost no American civil engineering. The craft was being invented in the field, on the job, by men who were too needed to stop and write down what they knew. By 1825, when the Erie Canal opened, Jervis had been on the project for 8 years. He was 30 years old. He had supervised the construction of 30 miles of canal, designed lock gates, solved problems with the cement supply, managed crews of 100 men at a time. When the canal was done, he kept building. He designed the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad in 1831, New York State's first steam railroad. He built the locomotive they named the DeWitt Clinton, named for the man who had put him to work as an axeman 14 years earlier, and ran it down the first stretch of rail in the state in 1831. By 1836, when they handed him the Croton project, he had built more miles of canal and railroad than any engineer alive on the continent. He had never attended a single class in engineering. Here is the problem he was handed in the fall of 1836. The Croton River ran through Westchester County, 41 miles north of the Battery at the tip of Manhattan. It was clean, cold, fed by granite ridges and forest with almost no industry upstream. In a normal year, it carried 60 million gallons of water a day. That water needed to arrive in Manhattan under pressure through enclosed pipes and mains, and it needed to do that entirely by gravity, no pumps. Steam pumps of the era were unreliable, expensive to operate, and prone to failure. If the water was going to flow continuously at the volume the city needed, it had to flow downhill the entire way, which meant Jervis needed to establish and maintain a continuous downward grade of exactly 13.5 inches per mile for 41 miles, across terrain that included rocky ridges in Westchester County, the wide valley of the Bronx River, the tidal barrier of the Harlem River, and finally, the streets of Upper Manhattan down to the reservoir he was going to build at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. 13.5 inches per mile. The precision required was extraordinary. A surveying error of even a few inches over a long section could create a flat spot or a reverse grade in the channel, and a reverse grade would stop the flow entirely. The water would back up, fill the tunnel, and eventually force its way out through any crack in the brick. Jervis walked the route himself, in addition to deploying his survey crews. He walked it in fall and winter, when the leaves were down and the ground profiles were most visible. He checked and rechecked the elevations. The calculation books from this period show him running the same numbers multiple ways, verifying each section by at least 2 independent methods. Nothing was trusted that had not been confirmed twice. Ground was broken July 4th, 1837. 20 years to the day after DeWitt Clinton had turned the first shovel at Rome, New York. The aqueduct was designed as a horseshoe-shaped brick tunnel, 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide at the base, running underground for most of its 41 miles. The brick lining was the heart of the design. Every inch of the interior surface had to be covered in hydraulic cement mortar and faced with hard-fired brick set so tightly that water pressure would find no crack to work into. A tunnel wall that allowed seepage would drain the system dry and undermine the surrounding soil within weeks. Jervis specified brick dimensions to within a 1/4 inch. He specified the exact mix ratios for the mortar. He specified the allowable water absorption rate for each brick. He inspected sections personally and rejected work that did not meet the tolerance. America had one reliable source of hydraulic cement in 1837, the Rosendale Stone Formation in Ulster County, New York, the same formation that Canvas White had identified while building the Erie Canal 2 decades before. Rosendale cement, burnt and ground at the right ratios, set as hard as granite in running water. Jervis needed it by the millions of bushels. The only way to deliver it to his construction sites scattered across Westchester County was by wagon-over roads that in spring became rivers of mud and in winter froze into corrugated ruts that shook barrels apart. He contracted for the cement supply in the fall of 1836. It arrived late, it arrived wet, it arrived in barrels that had been poorly sealed and had begun to set in transit. Entire shipments were condemned on arrival and sent back. By the summer of 1838, Jervis was writing to the water commissioners in the careful language of a man who has been let down by his supply chain and is managing the situation rather than losing his temper over it. The cement problem delayed the southern sections of the line by nearly a full construction season. The work went on regardless. The route was divided into 53 contract sections, each roughly 3/4 of a mile long, put out to bid. Local contractors, farmers, millwrights, men with teams of oxen and gangs of hands, signed up to dig, line, and backfill specific stretches. The contractor system was the same one that had built the Erie Canal. A man with an ox team and a gang of 15 could win a contract, execute the work, get paid by the cubic yard of dirt moved and brick laid, and move on to the next section when it was done. Some of those contractors were experienced men who had worked the Erie Canal or the first New York railroads. Some were local Westchester farmers who had never run a construction crew, and some ran their contracts poorly, stretched the cement mix too thin, let the brickwork drift off grade, and had their sections rejected on inspection and had to tear them out and relay them at their own cost. Almost all of the manual labour was done by Irish immigrants. They had been coming through the port of New York in growing numbers since the late 1820s. Men off the tenant farms of Connaught and Munster and Cork, off farms their grandfathers had worked, who had paid for steerage passage with money borrowed against future wages, and who walked north from the city to wherever the construction was hiring. They knew how to work with dirt and stone. They knew how to swing a pick and push a barrow in a sustained rhythm for 10 hours. They knew how to do what the foreman showed them and to keep doing it until dark. They were paid between 75 cents and $1 a day, the lower rate for general laborers, the higher for men with some skill or experience. Bricklayers earned more. Blasters earned more. A foreman earned $1.50. At peak construction in 1839 and 1840, there were between 4,000 and 5,000 men working the Croton line. They lived in construction camps that followed the work north through Westchester County. The camps were temporary settlements of board shanties and canvas tents built wherever the contractor could clear flat ground near the line. The food was beans, salt pork, bread, and coffee. The water came from whatever spring or creek was available. Sanitation was minimal. A fever moved through the camps in the summer of 1839, running south to north through the labor force, killing perhaps 200 men over the course of 3 months before it burned out in the fall cold. The records are incomplete. Contractors did not keep mortality records. The county death registers caught some of the deaths and missed others. The men who died in the camps were often buried near where they fell, in ground close to the line, and no marker followed most of them. I want to stop here and name 2 of those men, because 4,000 is a number, and numbers do not tell you what it cost. I found the first name in a contractor's payroll ledger, cross-referenced against a Westchester County death register from the fall of 1839. The ledger is held at the Westchester County Archives in Elmsford. The pages are water-stained at one corner, and the ink has faded to the color of dried clay, but the entries are legible if you look at them under the right light. His name was Brendan Shaughnessy, aged 26, born in County Roscommon. On a tenant farm his father had worked before him, on a hillside above the River Suck in the west of Ireland. He came to New York in the spring of 1838 on a timber ship out of Sligo, paid for his passage with a promissory note against his first months of wages, and signed on with a contractor named Westervelt, who was working a section of the line through the rocky ridgeline north of Yonkers. That section required tunneling through granite rather than digging an open trench. You could not dig granite with a spade. You drilled it and you blasted it. The tunnel crews worked in pairs, one man holding the drill bit and turning it with each stroke of the hammer, one man swinging a 4-pound iron hammer, the 2 of them trading off every few minutes because the wrist and shoulder load of hammer work breaks you down fast. They drilled holes 2 feet deep in solid granite, packed the holes with black powder, tamped the charge with a wooden rod, lit the fuse, and ran for the mouth of the cut while the powder went. Then they went back in and cleared the broken rock by hand with short-handled shovels, in the dark, in air still thick with powder smoke and stone dust, by the light of tallow candles set in iron holders spiked into the tunnel wall. The ventilation in the cuts was poor. Men worked for hours in air that fouled fast. The noise of hammer on drill in a low granite tunnel is not a sound so much as a physical concussion, something you feel in your chest and your skull and your back teeth more than you hear it. The men who did it long enough went partially deaf. Some went deaf entirely, and you would see them on the line afterwards, working, reading lips to get the foreman's instructions. On October 3rd, 1839, Brendan Shaughnessy was at the face of the Yonkers cut clearing rubble from a blast when a second charge, a charge that had failed to detonate on the first attempt, that had been called dead by the powder man, went off. The contractor's investigation noted that the charge had been loaded in a natural seam in the granite wall, where the powder could sit protected from the initial flame and then detonate minutes later from residual heat in the rock. The crew had been told to wait 20 minutes before approaching a dud. The ledger entry for October 3rd shows Shaughnessy present at morning roll and then notes his name in the right-hand margin with a single word: killed. He was buried in a section of a Yonkers churchyard reserved for canal and railroad workers, in a row of field stones that served as markers. His name does not appear in the church's burial register. I found it only in the contractor's payroll. His final week's wages, $4.50, are marked as unclaimed. He had been in America for 18 months. The second man was older. His name was Hugh Carew, age 39, from County Clare, on the west coast of Ireland, who had been in America since 1832, who had worked the New Jersey railroads before coming north to the Croton line in 1838. He was a mason. He had learned stonework in Ireland, on the limestone walls and farmhouse chimneys of the Burren country, and he was skilled at it, genuinely skilled, the kind of man whose eye for level and plumb and square had been refined by years of work, not months. The supervisors put him on the bridge crossings and the lock chambers, the sections of the aqueduct where the stone had to be cut and set to tolerances most of the men on the line could not hold consistently. The aqueduct crossed 33 streams and roads along its 41-mile run. At each crossing, the channel had to be carried over on a small stone arch, and each arch had to maintain the grade exactly, because a crossing even slightly high would create a hump that would slow the water and reduce the daily flow through the system. The stone for those crossings was dressed to within a quarter inch. Each arch was set stone by stone, each piece fitted into position and checked for level before the next was laid. The work could not be hurried. A joint that was out by 1/8 of an inch would allow water pressure to work into it over years, wicking into the mortar, and eventually the arch would crack. Hugh Carew worked the line from 1838 to the fall of 1841. In October of 1841, the water commissioners made their first full inspection tour, walking the entire 41 miles in sections over the course of 2 weeks, examining the brickwork and the mortar joints and the stone crossings. The inspection report, which is held in the New York City Municipal Archives, notes the work on the crossings in Carew's section as among the finest on the entire line. The inspector writes, "The stonework on these crossings reflects exceptional care in the dressing and setting, and the grade has been maintained to within the tolerance specified throughout." The report names the contractor. It does not name Hugh Carew. He appears one more time in a payroll entry dated November 14th, 1841, and then nothing. He may have gone on to work the High Bridge project, which was still underway. He may have left the county. I cannot find him past that date. The finest stonework on the line. Unnamed. Those are 2 men out of 4,000. Before I tell you what happened the morning the water arrived in Manhattan, please subscribe. I know I ask. I ask because these stories reach no one unless the algorithm is told that people want them. 1 click. Come back. The hardest engineering problem on the entire project was not the 41 miles of brick tunnel. It was the 100 yards of Harlem River. The aqueduct had to cross the Harlem River at the northern edge of Manhattan Island. The Harlem was tidal at that point, navigable by small cargo sloops and schooners, and any fixed crossing had to clear the mast height of those vessels at minimum 40 feet above the high water line. Jervis designed a masonry arch bridge with 15 spans, each arch a full semicircle of dressed granite, the whole structure rising 114 feet above the river at the crown of the deck. It was the tallest stone bridge in the Western Hemisphere when it was completed. He modelled it on the Roman aqueducts. He had studied printed engravings of the Pont du Gard in southern France, the Roman bridge aqueduct that has been carrying water continuously for 2,000 years. He had studied prints of the Aqua Claudia on the outskirts of Rome. He was not interested in originality when permanence was available. He had built enough temporary structures on the Erie Canal and the railroads to know the difference between a thing built to last a decade and a thing built to last a century, and he was not going to bring water 41 miles and then lose it to a bridge that rotted. The foundations were the problem. The bridge piers had to be sunk in the Harlem River itself, in tidal water, on the river bottom. The men who built those piers worked from timber cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures driven into the riverbed to hold back the tide while the masons worked inside. A cofferdam leak in a tidal river is a crisis. You are suddenly working in rising water in an enclosed space 12 feet below the river surface, and the only answer is to bail faster than the water comes in while someone fixes the breach from outside. Jervis's notebooks describe 3 cofferdam failures on the High Bridge piers between 1839 and 1841. Each one cost time and cost money, and in at least one case came close to drowning the crew working inside the enclosure. The stone for the bridge came from the quarry at Sing Sing Prison, up the Hudson River, cut by convicts under contract to the water commissioners and floated down on barges to the construction site. The final dressing, the precise shaping of the arch stones to specification, was done at the site by skilled masons. Some of them were Scotsmen from the quarry towns of Fife and Angus. Some were New England men from Vermont and New Hampshire. They were among the best stoneworkers on the continent, and they still took 3 years to complete the bridge from the time the cofferdams went in. The High Bridge opened in 1848. The aqueduct itself had been carrying water since 1842. For 6 years, Croton water crossed the Harlem River through temporary cast iron pipes suspended on timber supports, while the stone bridge was built alongside them. When the bridge opened, the pipes were transferred into the stone channel and the temporary supports came down. From that day until 1955, the water of the Croton River travelled 41 miles by gravity and arrived in Manhattan across those 15 stone arches. The High Bridge still stands. It was opened to pedestrian traffic in 2015 after a long restoration. You can walk across it today. The granite piers above the waterline are the same stone that came down from the Sing Sing quarry in 1840. You can see the chisel marks on the dressed faces if you look closely. Parallel grooves left by a straight chisel moving fast, the mark of a man working with the efficiency that comes from doing the same motion for years. The arch profiles above the water are exactly what Jervis drew in his notebooks in the fall of 1836, copied from bridges that were already 1,500 years old. On June 22, 1842, John B. Jervis opened the gate at the Croton Dam. He had been on site for 2 days, walking the final sections one more time. He was 47 years old, 5 years of construction, 4,000 men, 53 contract sections, 3 major redesigns mid-project. One of the dam, one of an aqueduct section in Yonkers, where the ground proved softer than the original survey showed, one of the terminal reservoir in Manhattan, where the commissioners changed the design after the foundations were already in. He had fought the water commissioners over budget. He had fought contractors over quality. He had managed a cement supply that delivered wrong, a winter in 1839 that froze the construction sites for 11 weeks, and an inspection board that visited sections without warning and sometimes without understanding what they were looking at. When Jervis opened the gate on June 22nd, he believed the job was done. The water began to move at roughly 3 miles an hour. At that pace, the leading edge would take about 14 hours to travel the 41 miles from the dam to the distributing reservoir at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. Jervis and the water commissioners rode ahead in stages, stopping at inspection hatches at intervals along the line to watch the water rise in the dark channel and then keep going. At each station, they noted the time and the water surface elevation. The grade held, the brick held. At each stone, crossing the water passed under without a leak. 14 hours after Jervis opened the gate at the Croton Dam, the water arrived in Manhattan. It reached the distributing reservoir at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street on the morning of June 27, 1842, at a few minutes past 9 o'clock, within 15 minutes of Jervis's calculated arrival time. I have read the diary entry that Philip Hone wrote that afternoon. Hone was a former mayor of New York, a wig merchant who had kept a meticulous diary of city life for 40 years. He was not given to sentiment. On June 27th, he wrote that he went to the fountain in City Hall Park and cupped his hands under the water and drank from them. He wrote that it was cold. He wrote that it tasted of nothing. He wrote, "Nothing is talked of or thought of in New York but Croton water." The formal celebration was July 4th, 1842. 40,000 people came to City Hall Park. There were processions, speeches, a military band, fireworks after dark. The fountain in the park ran all day without stopping. Clean, cold Croton water erupting in the center of a city that had been drinking contaminated well water for 40 years. People lined up to drink from cupped hands. A woman standing near the fountain was heard to say she had never tasted water that had no taste. She meant it as a wonder. A painting was made of the celebration. It shows the fountain, the crowd, the buildings of Park Row behind, the sky full of July light. It does not show Brendan Shaughnessy buried under a fieldstone in Yonkers with $4.50 in unclaimed wages. It does not show Hugh Carew, who cut the finest stonework on the line and vanished from the records in November of 1841. Here is what the aqueduct did to New York. The cholera mortality rate fell, not immediately, not completely, but it fell hard. The 1849 epidemic killed roughly half as many New Yorkers per capita as the 1832 epidemic had. Part of that was improved medical understanding. Part of it was the water. The ability to clean streets, flush sewers, launder bedding, and wash hands at scale was not possible without a pressurized water supply. By 1866, during the last major cholera epidemic to strike New York, the city had the lowest death rate of any major Eastern American city. The aqueduct was not the only reason. It was a significant part of why. Fire insurance rates in Lower Manhattan dropped by roughly a third in the 5 years after the aqueduct opened. The companies that had stopped writing policies in the densely built blocks south of Canal Street after the 1835 fire began writing them again. The Great Fire had made Lower Manhattan functionally uninsurable. Running water at pressure through cast iron mains, connected to standpipes on every other corner, changed the actuarial tables. The population of New York grew from 312,000 in 1840 to 515,000 in 1850, the largest decade of growth in the city's history to that point. The Irish famine, beginning in 1845, sent an enormous wave of immigration through the port of New York, and the city absorbed it in part because it now had the infrastructure to sustain it. Without the Croton Aqueduct, a city of 500,000 people drinking from contaminated wells in an era before germ theory would have been uninhabitable within a decade. The infrastructure came first. The city came after it. That is always how it works. The distributing reservoir at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street was an Egyptian revival structure, 40 feet of sloping stone wall rising above the street, a promenade along the top where New Yorkers walked on Sunday afternoons and looked down into the water. Mark Twain, when he came through New York in the 1860s, called it the most impressive public structure he had seen in the city. It held 20 million gallons and was considered an architectural landmark. It was demolished in 1899. The building that replaced it, which opened in 1911, is the New York Public Library. The library was built on the same stone foundation walls that supported the reservoir. The basement of the library, where the rare books vaults are, where the original Philip Hone diaries are kept in archival boxes, where the Jervis engineering notebooks sit in their flat, acid-free folders, sits on stone that was cut for a water tank in the 1840s. The building that holds the record of how the aqueduct was built is standing on the foundation of the reservoir the aqueduct filled. The original Croton Aqueduct was expanded twice before it was superseded in 1955 by the larger Delaware Aqueduct system. The old tunnel is mostly closed now. In Westchester County, its route is marked by a hiking trail, 41 miles along the buried channel through suburban woodlot and golf course and park. At intervals along the trail, the original ventilation shafts still protrude from the ground. Some are sealed with modern concrete caps. Some have been fenced. One, in the northern Bronx, still has the original brick shaft intact below the grate. You can look through the grate and see the brickwork going straight down in the dark, 16 feet to the channel floor. The mortar still tight after 180 years, the grade still running. I have walked the section near Yonkers. The trail runs along a residential street for a stretch and then ducks into a narrow strip of trees behind a row of houses. The ventilation shaft in that section is about 30 feet off the path, half hidden in a stand of ailanthus and sumac. I put my hand on the capstone. It is the original cut stone from the 1830s. The chisel marks are still on the underside of the cap where someone roughed the surface to fit. Not decorative cuts, working cuts, made fast, made to do a job, by someone who was moving through a section that had to be done by a certain date for the contractor to get paid. Brendan Shaughnessy worked somewhere near that shaft. I cannot be more specific. The Westervelt contract covered the Yonkers section, but the payroll does not say exactly which face of the cut. The tunnel extends north and south under my feet. He could have worked any part of it. He was 26 years old. He had been in America for 18 months, and he died 20 feet underground in a granite cut with $4.50 in wages that no one ever collected, and the contractor wrote one word beside his name. John B. Jervis retired from the Croton project in 1842, the year the water came in. He went on to design the Hudson River Railroad. Then he retired to Rome, New York, where he had started as an axeman 25 years before. He built the town a library. He donated his books to it, his collection of engineering references and natural history texts and mathematics, including the same English textbooks he had taught himself from by lamplight in the Erie Canal construction camps in 1818. He died in 1885 at the age of 90, at his desk, still reading, still taking notes. The Jervis Public Library in Rome, New York, still stands. It is the oldest public library building in New York State, still operating for its original purpose. The books he donated are there in a reading room on the second floor, some of them the same volumes he carried into the field 60 years before. The margins have his pencil marks. He is the reason the city has water, and he is in part the reason the men who dug the ditch are not remembered because their names were not on the building. They were in the contractor's ledgers, in the payroll books, in the county death registers that survived by accident in courthouse basements and archive stacks. I keep finding them, one at a time, in ink that fades a little more each year. Please subscribe. If you have stayed with me this far, you know what this channel is doing. I will keep looking for these men for as long as you tell the algorithm that you want me to. It costs nothing to click the button. It costs me months to find the names. One click, 41 miles, 13.5 inches per mile, 53 contracts, 4,000 men, 5 years. The water runs in New York tonight because in October of 1839, Brendan Shaughnessy stood at the face of a tunnel in the dark and held the drill while the man next to him swung the hammer and the stone came loose and the channel moved forward and the work kept going. I'll see you in the next one.